Have you ever stopped to think about why, after a true awakening, love starts to seem different? Why that passion that used to be sweet and overwhelming now sounds like something that deserves to be questioned? And the most disturbing question, could it be that what we often call love might be something beyond what we imagined? What we don't face within ourselves tends to show up as a repeated pattern, sooner or later. Carl Jung said that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there's any reaction, both are transformed. Jacques Lacan taught that love is giving what you don't have to someone who doesn't exist. And there's an anonymous phrase, maybe you've even thought this yourself on a reflective night. Passion is the soul's fever. It heats up fast, burns from within, and then leaves you transformed. Many of us, at some point, have completely surrendered ourselves to someone, not just with our body, but with our entire soul. There's a moment in the journey of those who awaken to certain patterns when traditional romantic love starts to make less sense. Not because you became cold or cynical, but because you began to see the invisible dynamics that move many relationships. That magical feeling of finding someone special can reveal itself as a projection of the unconscious seeking to complete itself through another person. The passion you considered the most real thing can be an altered state of consciousness where you were, in part, running away from internal issues. And a significant discovery. You may have spent years giving your heart to idealized versions of people, blank screens where you projected your unmet needs. This realization can be uncomfortable, because it suggests that an important part of your emotional life was built on foundations that deserve to be reconsidered. And maybe you sense this deep down, but chose not to investigate because the romantic narrative was more comfortable than exploring your own loneliness. Most relationships, when you observe them with honesty and without the cultural filters of romanticism, can function as an attempt to use the other person to relieve existential issues. Passion works similar to a fever. It rises quickly, leaves you in an altered state, seems very important, but tends to be brief and completely transforms you. You might surrender not because you found your soulmate, but because your soul finally found where it can rest and imagine it's being healed by someone external. Worth considering. In many cases, we're not properly loving another person for real. We're using that person as emotional relief to avoid clearly feeling who we really are. And this relief works so well at the beginning that you can swear you finally discovered the meaning of life. That special connection everyone's looking for. But maybe deep down, where honesty with yourself still exists, you know you're postponing the encounter with emotional issues you've always avoided facing head-on. Carl Jung had remarkable clarity about this psychological mechanism. He explained within his psychological interpretation that many human relationships are born from unrecognized wounds, from those emotional spaces you carry but rarely examine deeply. All that beautiful romantic poetry we recite can function as an elegant veil over internal issues. Awakening to these patterns changes your perspective because you have difficulty not seeing these dynamics. It's as if someone turned on the lights in the middle of the performance and you saw the entire structure. The sets, the devices, the constructions that sustain the narrative. The magic transforms not because you became bitter, but because you started to perceive. And once you clearly perceive, it can be difficult to ignore this awareness. You can even try to go back to believing in the original fantasy, but something has changed. Lucidity has altered your way of looking at love and human relationships. And here's a fundamental understanding. This doesn't mean love ends. It means it transforms. The intensity of passion can give way to something more conscious, more present, perhaps less dramatic but potentially more true. It's not loss, it's transformation. Jung gave a name to a specific process, psychological projection, one of the most powerful and complex mechanisms within the human mind. In many cases, we completely idealize the other as if that person were our emotional salvation, as if just being near them were enough for internal issues to resolve themselves. The perception that can be uncomfortable is that we're often not seeing the real person in front of us. We're seeing an internal image we project onto them like a movie screen. And when that projection eventually dissolves, it's not necessarily the other person's betrayal. It can simply be the end of the fantasy you yourself constructed. The person may not have changed, you just started to see more clearly. They may have always been what they are now, you were just perceiving through emotional filters. This discovery can be intense, because it suggests you were simultaneously author and observer of your own romantic narrative. And there isn't necessarily anyone to blame besides yourself. There's a concept within Jungian psychology called anima and animus that offers an interesting interpretation. Anima is the internal feminine aspect present in men. Animus is the internal masculine aspect present in women, according to this approach. The hypothesis is that we project these archetypal figures onto people who cross our path, and when we find someone who seems to fit this internal image, we call it love at first sight. But maybe it's not exactly love in the traditional sense. It can be powerful imagination driven by emotional need, the unconscious signaling that it recognized something familiar. That's why this sensation can be so magnetic and intense, so similar to destiny, because you may not properly be meeting another person, but recognizing your own fragments that were disconnected. The challenge is that these parts probably aren't really in the other person, they're inside you waiting to be integrated. And while you don't do this internal work, you can continue projecting and being surprised by patterns that repeat with different people but always similar dynamics. A significant irony of this process is that in many cases, we're relating to aspects of ourselves without being fully aware of it. We can love in the other those parts of ours that were rarely properly recognized, those pieces of identity that need to be seen, chosen, validated somehow. Intense passion can become a ritual of the ego seeking to reorganize itself through another person. That's why it can hurt so much when it ends. Maybe it's not exactly the physical loss of the other that affects you most, but the perception that you were alone in a certain way this entire time. You may notice that that feeling of completeness came less from the person by your side, and more from your ability to project onto them everything you sought to find within yourself. And when this understanding arrives with force, it can be disorienting because it questions many previous certainties. Awakening to these patterns can remove emotional filters gradually but consistently. Suddenly the other appears more clearly, human, with limitations, common aspects. That special aura you attributed can dissolve, and you see a normal person with their own issues, their own needs, their own path. And when the idealized image falls apart, often what emerges is an empty space that can be disturbing. Not necessarily because love ended, but because it may never have existed in the specific way you imagined. It may have been an elaborate mental construction, an emotional narrative shared between two people equally seeking something. And now that this narrative has ended, you can be left wondering who you really are when you're not playing the role of the passionate lover. This empty space can be simultaneously uncomfortable and liberating in unexpected ways. The ego tends to resist seeing the other as they really are, because accepting this can mean giving up the desire to be saved by someone. Loving projections can be intense and addictive, but it can also be fragile. And the real, when it appears without masks, transforms the entire narrative definitively. I'm not saying this to create discomfort, but to bring awareness. You may have spent years calling something true love that functioned more as an unconscious emotional agreement. And this dynamic was so well constructed culturally, by the media, by romantic literature, that we rarely question if it makes sense. After all, most people seek exactly this. Many want to find their soulmate, their other half. But what if this entire search is a detour from the true work, which is to become whole alone before inviting someone into your life? Intense passion can function as a way of not being fully with yourself. While you're immersed in that consuming intensity, you may not need to deal with deeper existential issues, with empty internal spaces, with childhood issues still unresolved. The other can become a shield against loneliness, against silence, against uncomfortable questions that arise when you're with yourself without distractions. Awakening to these patterns tends to bring some temporary loneliness, that's true. But it also brings a type of silence you may not have experienced before. And in this silence, the essential question can arise. Who am I when I don't need to be saved by anyone? Who am I when I take off the masks and look in the mirror without filters? The answer often surprises. You may simply not know. You may have spent a long time defining your identity through relationships and lost the notion of who you are when you're alone. If you're enjoying this content, maybe you'll also like our exclusive material that's in the first pinned comment. The love that can be born after this awakening to patterns isn't born from lack, it's born from conscious presence. It tends to be less explosive, less overwhelming, like those intense passions you may have romanticized. It's quieter, more sober, possibly more true in ways that might even seem strange at first. It's a love that may not need grandiose promises because it exists more fully in the present moment. It's the type of love that maybe can only exist between people who have already become more whole alone first, who don't need so much external salvation, because they've already organized themselves internally. And precisely because of this, it can be rare, because many people don't reach this point of maturity. Many prefer to continue in the intensity of passion, in the familiarity of drama, in the known emotional chaos. Because at least that's familiar, while this mature love can seem strange, even boring for those accustomed to constant intensity. That's why those who awaken to these patterns can seem more distant to those still living immersed in traditional romantic narratives. These people tend not to pursue love out of desperation. They don't make impossible promises. They don't create elaborate fantasies about perfect futures. They already recognize more easily the signs of ego disguised as true affection. They already know better how to differentiate obsessive desire from real love, compulsive need from conscious choice. The intensity of passion can give way to lucidity, and lucidity isn't always comfortable to observe. Many people prefer the intensity of collective delusion to the calm of truth. They prefer the emotional roller coaster to the firm ground of conscious presence. And when they meet someone who no longer plays this game, they can feel that this person is distant, detached, even incapable of loving. But maybe it's not inability to love, but a choice not to be fooled again in the same way. Awakening to these patterns isn't necessarily immediate enlightenment. It's not a permanent state of spiritual grace. It can be the gradual dissolution of fundamental illusions you built about yourself and about the world. It can be the end of social roles you've always played. The ideal lover, the savior, the chosen one, the special one. When these roles dissolve, what can remain is you in a more raw form before your own existence. And this can be more uncomfortable than any relationship breakup. Because a relationship breakup is losing someone specific, but awakening to patterns is questioning your entire self. Or rather, questioning the idea you had of yourself. It's discovering that you may have been a character playing other characters, and now you don't know exactly who the actor is behind the masks. One of the biggest changes this awakening can provoke is with emotional dependency. The romantic theater can end where two people pretend they're incomplete halves, looking for completeness in each other. The myth of the other half can end. This beautifully packaged narrative many absorb since childhood. Loving without needing to be externally completed can be loving with more maturity. But it requires you to face alone internal spaces you may have always delegated for another person to fill. And this confrontation can be intense. It's looking inward and recognizing empty spaces, unmet needs you may have expected a relationship to resolve. But a relationship may not resolve internal issues. It can only reflect amplified what's already inside you. Loneliness can emerge as a transitional phase, not necessarily as a permanent destination. The entire world lives immersed in romantic narratives, of impossible love stories, of happy endings. Those who awaken to certain patterns may have difficulty believing in these narratives the same way. They can see the structures behind the whole story, recognize repetitive patterns disguised as romance. And this lucidity, although liberating, can also create some temporary distance. It can be difficult to genuinely connect with people who still operate under certain patterns when you've already recognized those patterns. It's like trying to explain colors to someone who sees differently. It's not necessarily arrogance, it can just be frequency incompatibility. You may not be vibrating at the same frequency, and this creates a natural distance that sometimes bothers. Lucidity functions as clarity. It can dissolve fantasies, but it illuminates consciousness in a way that wasn't possible before. It can reveal how much of your life was lived under automatic patterns, how many relationships were ways of avoiding internal issues. Love can stop being a refuge and become an encounter. And true encounter requires presence, not escape. It requires you to be more whole, not fragmented between fantasies and projections. And being whole is work that can be scary, because it means consciously integrating even the parts of you that were rejected. Those aspects you hid thinking that way, they would disappear. But they tend to remain. They just stay hidden, waiting to appear in relationships in unexpected ways. If I tell you that many intense passions can be shadow aspects of the psyche disguised as true love, can you consider it? Obsessive desire, constant anxiety, need for external approval. All of this was culturally romanticized and presented as deep love. The shadow, in Jungian interpretation, seeks intensity and drama because that's how it manifests. And many relationships, if you observe honestly, can be emotional escapes disguised as meaningful encounters. The shadow is what you tend to deny in yourself, impulses and feelings that don't match the image you want to project. And when you don't deal consciously with it through internal work, it can manifest in relationships in complex ways. Intense jealousy, need for control, deep neediness, obsession disguised as intense love. Jealousy, control, neediness. These feelings can fuel entire relationships. Emotional discomfort can be confused with depth. Suffering can be romanticized as proof of true love. But worth considering. Maybe it's not love in the most mature sense. It can be insecurity being constantly activated. When you feel intense fear of losing someone, it may not be true love you're feeling, but fear of being alone with yourself again. It can be fear of losing emotional relief. It's the fear of having to face again internal spaces you avoid looking at. And this fear can be so intense that you call it love, because love seems nobler than admitting you may be using another person as emotional support. But maybe the reality is this: many relationships function as unconscious agreements between two people who tacitly agree not to develop, so they don't have to be alone with themselves. Facing your own shadow in the Jungian perspective means stopping demanding that the other carry what is exclusively yours. It means looking at your issues without asking someone to solve them. And when you do this honestly, something can change. Relationships can stop being born from urgency and start being born from conscious presence. You may not need someone so much to exist. You choose someone to share the existence that already has meaning. The difference can be significant. In the first case, the other is a condition for your emotional stability. In the second case, the other is a complement to a life that already works. And maybe only in the second case does love exist in the most mature sense, because love born from compulsive need can be more emotional dependency with a romantic name. Love without urgency can be strange at first. Desire can lose that intensity you confused with depth. Passion can lose the drama you thought was meaning. But what can emerge in its place is something more stable. Love as conscious choice, not as compulsive need. It's loving because you want to, not because you need to feel complete. And this can be the difference between dependency and freedom. Freedom to leave when it doesn't make sense anymore. Freedom to stay because it still makes sense. Freedom not to have to negotiate your integrity in exchange for companionship. Jung called this process individuation, the encounter with yourself. It's the integration of the persona with the ego, with the shadow, with what you may have denied. And loneliness in this process may not be punishment. It can be a functional space for reorganization. It's the place where you can know yourself without the usual distractions. It's where you can stop performing and start simply being. And this authentic being, at first, can seem empty because you may be so accustomed to social roles that the silence of authenticity sounds strange. But maybe it's not absence. It can be more genuine presence, without so many filters. Awakening to these patterns can bring the end of the search for external salvation. Maybe no one will fill the space that exists inside you. Maybe no one will solve your issues, your patterns, your unmet needs. These issues can be personal and non-transferable, and maybe only you can go through them. And when you accept this possibility, when you stop waiting for someone to do for you what only you can do, a different internal path can begin. It may not be an easy path, nor romantic, nor worthy of a Hollywood narrative. It can be temporarily lonely, confusing, sometimes uncomfortable. But it can be the path that leads somewhere more true. Becoming your own foundation is learning to be with yourself without constantly negotiating. It's building an internal structure solid enough that another person's presence is an addition, not a necessity. And when this happens, love can stop being a search and become a genuine encounter. You may not look for someone to fill empty spaces. You invite someone to walk beside a person who's already more internally organized. And this person can naturally attract other people in a similar situation, because maturity tends to recognize maturity. Presence tends to recognize presence, and neediness tends to recognize neediness. That's why you may have historically attracted certain types of relationships, because maybe you were vibrating at a specific frequency, and you attracted other people at a similar frequency seeking something through the other. So why can people who awaken to these patterns stop falling in love the traditional way? Maybe it's not because of trauma. not because of cynicism, not because they became cold people. It can be because they recognize certain patterns when they appear. It can be because they've already observed these dynamics repeatedly. And they can prefer the clarity of lucidity to the intensity of the traditional romantic narrative. They can prefer temporary and conscious loneliness to the theater of emotional dependency. Because conscious loneliness, although it can be uncomfortable, can be more productive than companionship based on shared illusions. Love, for those who awaken to certain patterns, can stop being a need and become a choice. It may not invade, not demand, not imprison. It can walk alongside, respect spaces, honor individuality. It can exist better between people who have already done certain internal work and don't need so much external salvation. It's a type of love that can be rare because it requires emotional maturity many may not develop. It requires courage to be with yourself, to go through internal discomforts, to look at your own aspects you prefer to avoid. And many people may not want to do this work. They can prefer to continue in the known cycle of projection, disappointment, separation, new projection. It can be easier, more familiar, less challenging. I know this can be difficult to hear, especially if you're still immersed in the romantic narratives culture presents. But love may not die after this awakening. It can transform. From feverish intensity, it can become constant presence. From dependency, it can become conscious presence. From need, it can become free choice. And maybe this is a type of love worth exploring. Because it can be the type that doesn't dissolve when projections fall. It can be the type that goes through reality without needing constant fantasies. And when you experience this, you can understand that you can't completely go back to the previous pattern. Once you recognize certain patterns, it can be difficult not to see them. A silent transformation in the ways of loving is happening. There are people who learn to relate without falling into old patterns, to choose without neediness as the main motivation, to invite someone into their lives after they're already more internally organized. And this transformation may not make noise, may not become a trend, may not become a popular narrative, but it can be changing the way some people relate. It can be creating a different possibility of human connection, one that's based less on mutual need and more on shared presence. If you made it this far and something resonated with these reflections, maybe it's time to consider building more internal presence before seeking external love. Maybe it's time to exchange intensity for clarity, need for conscious choice. And if you feel alone in this process, worth remembering, conscious and temporary loneliness can be more constructive than companionship based on unquestioned patterns. Because maybe no one can fill internal spaces that are exclusively yours. Maybe no one can solve issues that are from your own path. And the faster you consider this, the faster you can stop looking for salvation where it may not be. In the other. Internal reorganization, if it exists, can be in you. It can be in having courage to look inward, to integrate rejected aspects, to make peace with parts of yourself that were denied. It can be in stopping waiting for someone to come rescue you and starting to reorganize yourself alone. It can be temporarily lonely work. It can be uncomfortable. It can seem thankless. But it can be the work that really transforms. And when you transform, when you become more whole, love can appear differently. Not as a need, but as a choice. Not as salvation, but as celebration. Not as filling a void, but as sharing presence. This can be love after this awakening. It may not shout, not invade, not promise eternity. It can simply be there, more stable, more true, more present. If this content stirred something inside you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Because the more people consider these perspectives, the more relationships can become conscious and mature. The more people understand that the work can be internal, the fewer relationships can function in dysfunctional patterns. And maybe we can create connections that work better, not because they need to exist, but because they're consciously chosen. Not because they're running from themselves, but because they've already found themselves internally. Not because they're seeking external completeness, but because they're already more whole.